So as we begin this brand new unit, the first thing we're going to look at is the issue of agriculture, and that is the planting and growing of crops and the raising of animals for food production and consumption. So some of the things we want to take away from this unit, describing where and why certain agricultural practices take place throughout the world and have developed in specific ways, examine the different ways countries deal with food security, so the issue of actually getting food access, and other threats related to agricultural practices, and then identifying and explaining attempts at increasing the world's food supply and types of aid given to farmers. So how do we support farmers and how do we support those struggling in order to get food, and especially healthy food, as we will see throughout this chapter. All right, so first thing to really discuss here is some review some of the things we've kind of talked about in relation to agriculture going all the way back to chapter 1 back in September. So here's this map of physiological density. So when we talked about density, and we talked about this in chapter 2 with population. So we talked about the different types of density and why does that matter. So we come up to this term physiological density. And so this goes back to the issue of arable land and how many people do we have on pieces of arable land. And arable land is the territory or the land that we can use for agriculture, whether again that is planting certain crops or raising and domesticating animals for, again, food production, consumption. Thinking about like animal herding, ranching, things of that nature. Okay, so if physiological density is high, that means the country has less agricultural land to feed its population. So we connect that back to the idea of sustainability. So a place like Egypt, as we'll see here, okay, has a very high physiological density. While the country itself is actually pretty sparse in terms of its population to the overall land area, most of the population is here along the Nile River Valley. Okay, right here along the Mediterranean, then as it follows the Nile River, 98% of the population is found in this part of the country. And because that's really the only area that they can really grow and feed animals as well, or sorry, not grow just animals, but also growing crops to feed the population, that means they have a high physiological density because this is the amount of land that they have to rely on in order to feed themselves, which is still a big concern, but it used to be a much bigger concern before globalization. So compare that with a country like the United States. While we do have a much larger population than Egypt, we have more land and also more agricultural land to be using for, again, planting, growing of crops, and raising of animals. All right, other countries, a lot of them being in the desert areas would be very similar to this, but also areas that just, again, have restricted land use. So Great Britain, Iceland, China being very mountainous in many cases. They're also having a very high population. Same thing again with places like Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, more mountainous, more rugged areas in the sense of Japan and South Korea, with very large populations. So that's why physiological density matters. So when we talk about agricultural density, this is the number of farmers to the amount of land or amount of arable land. So how many farmers do we have per square mile, square kilometer, whatever of whatever the ranges that we're using here, but just on the amount of land that we can actually again practice agriculture on. So more developed countries need fewer farmers, remember, to produce food due to technology, because we have better access to technology, better access to resources, things of that nature, that we can grow more food with fewer people as a result of said technology. So again, the United States, again, very small. Number of farmers in the United States has been constantly decreasing over the decades and the processes of the U.S., but again, you think about your areas of high physiological density, but also again, what types of things are people doing to produce food, produce for the economy, for themselves, things of that nature. And again, it falls into much of Southern or South Asia. So that's again, Afghanistan, India, Bangladesh, East Asia. So the Koreas, China, Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Myanmar, Cambodia, Indonesia, so on and so forth. And again, much of just Africa in general fits this very high. And then there are some other places as well, but for the most part, this is the region, or these are the regions that are that have high agricultural density, and in many cases also overlap, not completely, with higher areas of physiological density, but those are two very different issues. So when we talk about the history of agriculture, okay, initially we developed from what we call hunter-gatherer societies. All right, so we don't really know exactly how humans sort of discovered that we could, replant crops, replant vegetables and fruits. But again, it was probably just kind of playing around and figuring things out. But we believe that it happened about 10,000-ish years ago when this all began to develop. And so when we talk about agriculture itself, so again, the growing of crops, raising of animals, It's the deliberate modification of the Earth's surface through these means in order for us to, essentially live. That's sustenance, so being able to sustain ourselves, or economic gain, buying and selling of other goods or products. Okay, so before then, we had hunter-gatherer societies, very small groups, clans, tribes, familial kin societies, things of that nature, where you essentially moved around hunting and gathering. You gathered crops and then you hunted animals. You didn't sit down and actually try and raise a bunch of sheep, pigs, cows, things of that nature, and you didn't, sit down and start a farm. That just did not exist, again, until about 10,000-ish years ago. All right. So the agricultural revolution is when we start to actually learn how to domesticate plants and animals, where we start learning how to grow crops and how to raise animals. So no longer relying entirely on hunting and gathering, but we obviously still do those things, specifically the hunting piece. That's never really gone out. It's just decreased over time as a necessity for our everyday food. All right. So what this allows is the fact that once we now have a stable food supply, we don't have to move around as much. So thus, we begin what we call to form settled societies, where we're essentially settling ourselves down in one place, growing our crops, and that also means that we typically have more of a surplus because it's more reliable that way, because we don't have to go out and search for food. We don't have to continually move around in order to feed ourselves. All right. So when that occurs, we get that surplus of food. Thus, we have humans that are living longer, and this will connect itself into the demographic transition. All right, so there's that coming back. So over time, our techniques and food preferences are changing as cultures develop and interact with one another. So we're going to show the Columbian exchange here in a sec, that leads to different crops and animals being grown and found around the world. Okay, so yeah, so some of the ideas about the agricultural revolution, connecting it back to the ideas of maybe the last real ice age, people wanting a permanent resident and not moving around as much. And then, deliberate or accidental, like I said, experimentation with crops and planting and figuring out, hey, this actually works. So with the Columbian exchange, this is the stuff once, the Americas are found by Europe, having existed on their own for thousands of years. And so here's the stuff that is brought over to the Americas from Europe, so from Europe, Africa, and Asia. So you can think about the terms of livestock, the wheats and grains, as well as the diseases. That's unfortunate too. But also the other things that are brought in, onions, olives, turnips, coffee beans, things of that nature, brought over from Afro-Eurasia over to the Americas. And then the things that are brought back, okay, from the Americas to Afro-Eurasia, so pumpkins, potatoes for sure, tobacco, cocoa beans, potatoes, tomatoes, corn, peanuts. And these have a really big effect on shifting everybody's diets, because now you're able to grow different types of food, more foods in particular. And for things like potatoes that, don't need as much water, they're very drought-resistant types of food. Same thing with corn, I believe. Don't hold me to that. I think peanuts might also be that too. I'm not 100% on that. But because of that, we're now able to, grow foods that may not have been able to, that take less water. So places like, using China as an example, or even other places in Southeast Asia, so Vietnam, where rice, especially in the very monsoon needing regions, rice is a very big staple. And when you're able to bring in other types of food, such as potatoes that are very much drought resistant, you don't need as much water. You can start utilizing other lands, and again, improving of diets, and because you're getting more variety in there, and you're getting other types of protein and things that are more stable, you can again now live longer. So this leads to an overall population growth over the last 500 years, when we begin to start seeing that take off at the same time, when we start seeing other things with industrialization, that last 200, 300-ish years, that'll lead to, longer lifespans, lower death rates, and then that will coincide with demographic transition of decreasing births and things of that nature. Okay, so in terms of where this all started, again, about 10,000-ish years ago, it really all began sort of, oddly enough, very independently in various different parts of the globe around the exact same time period. So, and then that movement, as agriculture spreads from these various areas, so like here within East Africa, kind of around Ethiopia, Kenya, the Sudan, here in the Middle East, and then over to Europe, China. A little bit there within India, again here kind of in Central America, Central and South America. And again, a lot of these are right here around the equator. So the equator and the Tropic of Cancer, that's probably not a coincidence that this is kind of where this stuff began. All right, so And then you might want to think, that overlap of, types of geographic locations and things of that nature in terms of, the different types of agriculture that is practiced or the types of climate that exist there. So that kind of wraps up this very first video on the introduction of agriculture, a bit of the history and a bit of review going back to the beginning of the year with the types of agricultural and physiological density and how that affects it. So kind of in this next one, we'll look at some of the different types of agriculture and food security. And actually, we'll just kind of talk about this here in the first video. So we'll actually talk about food security in the next one. Okay, we have subsistence versus commercial agriculture. All right, because this actually fits in very, very well. So in terms of these types, so subsistence means that you're doing it to sustain yourselves. You're not doing it necessarily to sell food or to make money. You're doing it to feed yourself and your family. All right, so hence consumption by the farmer's family. All right, this is mostly found in what we call less developed or developing countries. Typically, they don't have a lot of land, not a lot of access to technology or new types of crops and things of that nature. So the farms are actually very, very small, average about 2.5 acres. Think that most houses, here in Inver Grove Heights, probably, your average house, if you like walk down Cahill or 80th, you kind of see those houses in surrounding neighborhoods. They're probably maybe half an acre, maybe a little more in terms of the size of their land and everything with the house and the yards and things of that nature. So you could think, multiply that by about, 5, and that's the size of their farm. So not bad size, but again, not enough to be producing to sell and make a lot of money on. Okay, typically often using hand tools and animal power rather than machinery. And also in many of these developing countries, we have large percentage of the workforce is in agriculture. So typically on average, 44% of the workforce in these subsistence agricultural societies are farmers. Okay, comparatively, on the other hand, we have what we call commercial farming. Okay, that's the production of food to sell, all right, off the farm. So again, this doesn't necessarily just mean crops, but it could also mean animals. So selling them for, to the slaughterhouses, for production, things of that nature. Okay, these are found in more developed or what we call developed countries, so MDCs. And typically these are larger farms, so average size in the United States is 418 acres, which again is a very large amount in terms of that. So more technology is used here. So we got machine labor, increases productivity because you don't need as many humans and the machines can work faster and more diligently. You have better infrastructure to support the transporting of goods. So think roads, bridges, waterways, airlines, railroads, things of that nature in order to more effectively sell these goods. And then there's access to what we call modern farming practices to increase the yield crop. So better fertilizers, herbicides, hybrid plants that are more, things like drought resistant, pesticide resistant, things of that nature. So typically in these countries, it's a small portion of the workforce that actually works within farming, not necessarily within the sale of farming, but within like the actual farming. So like growing of crops, raising of animals, things of that nature to provide, and they typically provide beyond their country. They're selling internationally. All right, and so in most countries that we consider to be developed or more developed, okay, that's about 5% of the workforce. In the United States, it's 2%. But that, again, as we'll talk about the issue of agribusiness way down the road, there's more people involved in the production, or not necessarily the production, but like actual farming, society actions, things of that nature. There's more than just 2%, but the actual farming itself is, 2% of the U.S. population. And again, that has consistently shrunk over the years. So yeah, and then we'll leave on this map here. So the percent of labor that is engaged, the percent of labor force, and the number of people in a country that are working in agriculture. So the darker the green, the more people in there. So again, much of sub-Saharan Africa, large parts of South Asia and Southeast and East Asia, compared with, again, areas that are below 5%, like much of Western Europe, United States, Canada, Australia, Japan, parts of the Middle East. So, again, kind of a rough switch in there. But again, most developed countries do not, or more developed countries have fewer people engaged in agriculture. Even a place like China still has very large amounts. So we'll leave it on there with the ideas of subsistence and versus commercial farming, and we'll pick that back up here. So, and then I'll actually leave it on this one too. So, yeah, 5% of farms in the U.S., 75% of the country's total agriculture, 90% of commercial farms are still family owned and operated, but those are your local farms, but those are kind of going down and being bought out more and more. So, yeah. more things to consider that we will do in class. So we'll leave it at that.